Now I will turn it over to Eric Stellwagen and Sarah Darren to present the webinar, Exponential Smoothing, What is it and when should I use it?
Thank you, Sabina. As the slide says, my name is Eric Stellwagen, and I am a co-founder of Business Forecast Systems. We're a small software firm outside of Boston, and we develop and market the Forecast Pro product line. I've been working in the field of forecasting basically my whole professional career. I started off in 1984 at an engineering firm, and in 1986 I left that company and with a partner started Business Forecast Systems and developed the Forecast Pro product line. So today we'll be talking about exponential smoothing. I'm going to be covering sort of the basics, go through the models and how they work and how they're applied. And then my colleague, Sarah, will be taking us through some extensions of exponential smoothing. So I'm going to let Sarah introduce herself.
My name is Sarah Darren. Like Eric, I have spent my entire career doing statistics, modeling, analytics. I've been at a BFS for several years now, but I came to BFS with a background from Nielsen, where at Nielsen I did a lot of different types of marketing analytics, a lot of marketing mix modeling, but had the opportunity to work across a lot of different industries and gain a lot of the experience through that consulting background.
So here's a roadmap of what we're going to cover. We're going to start pretty general. We're going to talk about exponential smoothing models, give you sort of a conceptual overview of what they are and how they work. We're going to be running some examples throughout the webinar. We'll discuss the different parts of how we apply and build these models. So we'll look at how we do model selection, how we interpret the results. And as I mentioned previously, we'll also be looking at some extensions to exponential smoothing that can be quite useful in certain situations. We will be saving time at the end for questions. And as Sabina told us in the beginning, if you do have questions as we go, by all means, use the chat feature and submit them while they're fresh in your mind. So let's start off with some pros and cons. Here are some things that people say about exponential smoothing. For the most part, they're true. One thing is that it's simple to understand and simple to explain. I would say exponential smoothing is certainly simpler to understand and simpler to explain than a lot of other methods. This is because it really deals with components of data such as trend and seasonal patterns. And most people have a good conceptual understanding of what is a trend, what is a seasonal pattern. Sometimes statistical techniques focus more on properties of data and autocorrelation and things like that, which maybe your manager won't be that familiar with. But your manager certainly is going to be familiar with what is a trend, what is a seasonal pattern. And so these methods are simpler to understand and to explain to the uninitiated. Widely accepted and used amongst the statistical methods for generating forecasts, exponential smoothing is probably the most widely used, often the most accurate. There have been a lot of studies. These have taken different forms. Sometimes they're forecasting competitions sponsored by academic organizations. Sometimes they're research studies. But exponential smoothing has often been compared to other methods in terms of accuracy and has fared pretty well. There's also many companies have undertaken their own sort of analysis on what methods work best for their data. And anecdotally, I've certainly come across different companies that have compared different approaches to forecasting and come to the conclusion that exponential smoothing is often a good choice for their data. The model is adaptive. What I'm trying to say here is that as things are changing, so as the trends in your data change, as the seasonal patterns change, exponential smoothing is very good at adapting to changing data sets. It concentrates on recent history, and by doing so, it's able to adapt to changes as they occur. It's robust. It's very good at smoothing out over rough data sets. The name sort of suggests that, exponential smoothing. It's easy to apply. So hopefully we'll be illustrating that very shortly, but it is pretty straightforward in terms of model selection and optimizing the models. It can be automated, and that's a big advantage, particularly if we're forecasting lots and lots of items. Okay, so what are the downsides of exponential smoothing? The bullet here says it's a time series method. And what does that mean? A time series model is a model that is going to extrapolate from the past history. So that the sole basis for generating a forecast is the past history. Now, time series methods are useful when the future looks a good bit like the past. So when you've got series that are pretty stable, we've got various trends, they're changing in time, we have seasonal patterns, they may be changing in time, you know, things are pretty stable. This is when time series methods succeed. On the other hand, what if you promote your products and you vary when you promote your products? So time series methods have problems with that because it's not just the promotions are introducing volume or demand. It is not really based on what the volume or demand has been in the past, based on things like my promotional schedule. Or what if there are other factors at work? What if pricing is very important and we often change our pricing? Exponential smoothing, and for that matter, any time series method, is not going to be able to capture these kinds of relationships between demand for what you're trying to forecast and explanatory variables like price or measures of the economy, promotional schedules, etc. So we want to make sure if we're going to use exponential smoothing that it's appropriate and that a time series method can do a good job. Another downside about exponential smoothing is that implementations vary, and as the slide says, some are poor. When you look at forecasting methodologies, you'll see that some of them are absolutely standard. So regression, for example, there are absolutely standard ways of building and optimizing a regression model. If I build a regression model in Forecast Pro, and I build the same regression model in Excel, and I build the same regression model in SAS, the forecast will be, other than rounding error, exactly the same. This is not the case with exponential smoothing. Implementations will vary. Why? Because there are not absolutely standardized ways of doing certain operations. There's not a standard way of optimizing these models. There's not a standard way of initializing these models. If you build exponential smoothing models for the same data set in different applications, you will get different answers. But I have seen some cases where the implementation is truly poor and where it simply does not perform as well because they take shortcuts in some of the, usually in the optimization of the models. So before we get going with exponential smoothing models per se, I'm going to show actually a few things in Excel to get us thinking about the importance of data length. When we're doing time series methods, exponential smoothing, or any other time series methods, what you'll see is that data length is absolutely critical. Here is a data set. It's actually a very small data set. There's only one data point, 37,000. So our first month of demand, we had 37,000. How do you forecast this if this is all we're going to use is the past history? Remember, that's what a time series method does. It extrapolates from the past. What if we only have one data point? How are we going to extrapolate that? And I think the answer is the only reasonable way to do it in absence of other information would be to say, well, the forecast should be 37,000. I don't have information about is this trended upwards or downwards. I don't have information about is it seasonal. I don't have enough data to really do anything other than just say, well, that's what we sold last month, so I guess our best estimate will be the same. So let's get some more data. Here's 3 months worth of data. The first data point is actually a little over 37,000. The next one's a little under it. The third one goes up again, so it's right around 37,000. But we have 3 months worth of data. And once again, we're going to use exponential smoothing or another time series method. And we just don't have enough data. What can I do with 3 data points if I don't have any other information? And the answer is I'd probably average them, and I'd probably end up with a flat line forecast that would be the average of these 3 data points. Is that a good forecast? Given the circumstances of the only thing I have is 3 data points, I think it's a reasonable forecast. Is it likely to be very accurate? Probably not. What if I have 12 months? This is getting a little more interesting. So now I look at that data and I say, okay, is it trended? Is it going up or down? It's a little hard to say. If I took out a ruler or maybe did a regression against, say, time, I might find it has a little bit of a downward trend to it, and that might cause me to forecast this with a slight downward trend. Is it seasonal? I've got 12 months worth of data. I'm looking at it, and I certainly notice that it wiggles. Is it going up and down because it's seasonal? Or is it going up and down because it's simply fluctuating? Those up and downs are kind of random. I don't know. You see, with only 12 data points, I can't look at things like what are sales compared to the same month in the preceding year. So I can't really answer the question, are these data seasonal? Get more data. Here's 24 months worth of data. Now things are getting a little interesting. Are the data trended? No, they're pretty flat. Are the data seasonal? Yes, they are. And the way I can tell that, if I were in Forecast Pro, I'd pop it up in a year-over-year graph. But here in Excel, I can look at this month and see how it goes down in December, and then it goes back up as I go backwards. And I can see the same pattern in the preceding year. So if you're looking at the data points 12 months apart from each other, you know, both of these troughs, for example, are both in December. And then as we go back, you know, you've got this sort of shape that's repeating itself. And this is definitely indicative of a seasonal pattern. So if I were forecasting based on the 24 months using extrapolation, I'd probably say it's not trended, but it's certainly seasonal. And I'd probably have a forecast around here, and I'd superimpose some sort of a seasonal pattern on it. And that's something exponential smoothing can do, and we'll see this in action very shortly. But let's get some more data. Here's 36 months worth of data. So we've got 3 years now. Our forecast based on 2 years probably would have undershot what actually happened, because we looked at that and said it wasn't trended, and for our trend component, we were thinking it'd be down here. Now it's up here, and there are some questions. Is this a step? So we were selling that in this level, and then we kind of jumped up to this level, and now we're selling up here, and we should forecast here? Or is this an emerging trend? Are we starting to move upward, and our forecast should reflect a trend and carry forward that upward movement? It's hard to tell, even though we now have 3 years worth of data. And for a lot of us, 3 years worth of data is a lot of data. In terms of what do we want, ideally, in terms of data, we want more. So let's get some more. Here's 6 years worth of data. Now everything's easy, and that's really the point. Are the data trended? Yes, absolutely. There's a strong upward trend to the data. Yeah, it was a little flat in the beginning, but it picked up, and it's been pretty consistent for years. Are the data seasonal? Absolutely. Okay, I can look at this pattern, and I can see that there's a very clear seasonal pattern throughout the data. What I'm trying to get across here is the amount of data that you have when you're using a method like exponential smoothing becomes very important. If you have less than, let's say, 12 months worth of data, then you really shouldn't be using extrapolation. You just don't have enough data to answer basic questions like, are the data trended? Are they seasonal? And if so, how? As you get 2 or 3 years worth of data, there's more you can do. And this is where the methods start to be more effective. If you're using exponential smoothing, you really want to have at least 2 years worth of data, preferably more. And of course, that sort of begs the question of how much data do I need? You know, my company has been in business for 140 years, so I can go back 140 years. Well, you don't need to go back that far for exponential smoothing. What's on the screen now is about 6 years worth of data. And I usually tell people 6 or 7 years worth of data is optimal. Getting more really doesn't help you. The data has obviously lost its currency. It's not reflecting current conditions as well. On the other hand, with 6 or 7 observations of a seasonal pattern, you can really get at sort of the statistics behind the data. So in terms of exponential smoothing, data length is important. You really want to have 2 years or 3 years and preferably more. If you can go back and get more data, it's usually worthwhile. Your forecasting process should be thought of as a continuous improvement process. If I can start collecting more data, so now I only have 2 years, but next year I'll have 3, what is that going to mean? It means better forecasts. And the year after that, I'll have 4, and the year after that, I'll have 5, and my forecasts will continue to improve. So let's go back to our slides here and get a little more specific about exponential smoothing. So what is exponential smoothing? First of all, it's not really a method. It's a family of models. The models tend to focus, or the basic models, tend to focus on 3 different data components. Level, so sort of what is the sales level currently, trends, upwards or downward movement, and seasonal patterns. Are there times of year where we sell more than others? One of the assumptions behind an exponential smoothing model is that each component is changing in time, so that the current trends, the current seasonal patterns, the current sales levels will be different from what they were in the past and will be different going forward. There's another assumption behind the model, and that is that there's some random variation. Sometimes we refer to random variation as noise. But the concept here is that things are changing in time, and that also there's some random variation in addition to our 3 components of level, trend, and seasonality. Exponential smoothing, the real heart of the method, is trying to balance these 2 things. If something is changing in time, then there is a benefit to concentrating on the most recent data. Why? Because the most recent data reflects current conditions better than the preceding data. On the other hand, if there's random variation in the data, if there is noise, then using a lot of data and sort of smoothing out based on the past history allows us to get underneath that noise. This is the crux of exponential smoothing. It tries to balance the advantage of emphasizing recent history and thereby capturing change with the advantage of smoothing out using the past history and getting underneath the noise. And the way it does that is that it uses what's called smoothing weights, and they control the amount of emphasis to give the recent history versus the more distant past. Once we have built our exponential smoothing model, one of the things that is output from the model is what's called the final values. And the final values are basically what are our components, level, trend, and seasonal pattern, at the end of the data set. So what is the current sales level? What is the current trend? What is the current seasonal pattern? If I know these things, I can use them to construct the forecast. I mentioned previously that exponential smoothing really isn't a model, it's a family of models. And there are many different forms of exponential smoothing. In Forecast Pro, the exponential smoothing model family that we implement is something called the Holt-Winters family of exponential smoothing models. And what's depicted on our slide here is the forecasts that are generated from different types of Holt-Winters models. And what it kind of boils down to is 4 different ways of forecasting a trend and 3 different ways of forecasting a seasonal pattern. So one way I could forecast a trend is I could say there is no trend. If something is not trended, then we're not going to forecast that it's moving upwards or downwards. And our forecast, let's say it's not seasonal, would be a flat line. And the question is, where should that flat line be? And that forecast, depending on where we put that flat line, might have very different consequences. Another option for the trend is that it is trended, and it's a linear trend or a straight line trend. On the slide, we have shown an upward trend, an upward linear trend, and again, that would be an option as well. Another option would be a damped trend. A damped trend is something that starts off linear, but then peters out or dies out over time. So you can see it sort of starts out strong and then it's kind of dying out and eventually will go flat. And our 4th trend option is an exponential trend. An exponential trend is a trend that is growing as a percentage of itself. It's a model for the trend that you have to be a little careful with. If you're forecasting that something is growing exponentially, the forecast can really explode, okay? They can really take on extreme values going forward. And you want to make sure that if you use an exponential trend model, that it's truly appropriate. Forecast Pro is not going to automatically build an exponential trend model, but you can explicitly ask it to do so. So we've got 4 different ways we can forecast a trend. And there are, like, as I mentioned previously, there are 3 different ways we can forecast the seasonal pattern. One is it's not seasonal. Another would be it is seasonal and it's additive. And that's this depiction here. If we are assuming an additive seasonal pattern, what we're saying is that any given month sort of has a contribution up or down from the baseline trend. So a sort of an amount that we would add on for, say, for monthly data for each month. So if December is a strong month, then we'd add on a certain amount, and next December we'd add on that same amount. And what you get is sort of a uniform seasonal pattern. The alternative to that is what's called a multiplicative seasonal pattern, and it's actually much more common and I think more intuitive. In a multiplicative seasonal pattern, the seasonality can be thought of as a percentage. We sell 20% more in December. We sell 10% less in February. And if the data are trended, what you find is that the seasonality becomes more pronounced if we have an upward trend. Let's say that December boosts up by 20%. Well, we're taking 20% of a bigger and bigger number as we go forward in time because we're trended upwards. So the seasonality, again, sort of fans out or becomes more pronounced in a multiplicative seasonal pattern if you have an upward trend. It actually becomes less pronounced if you have a downward trend. The other seasonal patterns, if you put them on a damp trend or an exponential trend, are similar, but will take on, slightly different forms depending on the rate of change in the trend. Okay, but these are the 12 models in what I call the basic Holt-Winters family. Some of these models have names. So you may have heard of things like simple exponential smoothing or Holt exponential smoothing or Winters exponential smoothing. Simple exponential smoothing corresponds to this, which essentially says it's not trended and it's not seasonal. Another model with a name is the Holt model. So the Holt model is a model that is not seasonal but has a linear trend. And the Winters model. The Winters model has a linear trend and a multiplicative seasonal pattern. These names, Simple, Holt, and Winters, are things that you'll see in the literature. You'll see them certainly in Forecast Pro and in other softwares as well. Now, any of the 12 models can be identified using a little 2-letter nomenclature. You see these 2 letters here. The first letter is going to correspond to what type of a trend. So N for not trended, L for linear trend, D for damped, E for exponential. So using this little taxonomy, what we have is 2 letters to identify, the first one to identify what type of a trend, the second one to identify what type of seasonal pattern. So on the second letter, N is not seasonal, A is additive seasonality, M is multiplicative seasonality. So if I said, I used an LA model, then I'd use this one right here. So you'll see this convention used in Forecast Pro. You'll see it used in other software and in the forecasting literature. And it's just a way of saying which exponential smoothing model is being used. How do we build an exponential smoothing model? Well, one of the things we're going to have to do is to decide which model of those 12 is appropriate. So let's actually do that with an example. So I'm going to go into Forecast Pro, and we're going to look at the data set that was actually in the Excel slide set. In Excel, when we went through the data length, you were at a big disadvantage in that I told you nothing about the data. Business people do not forecast in a vacuum. You're not forecasting something that you don't know anything about. You're forecasting demand for products and services for your company, and you know exactly what you're trying to forecast. And that knowledge of what you're trying to forecast is important. We refer to that as domain knowledge. So let me give you a little bit of domain knowledge about this series. This data set comes from a telephone company. It is installations. You know, if I worked for this phone company, even if I only had one data point, if somebody said, are the data seasonal? My answer would be yes. Why? Because I know that what the data represent. I know it's installations. I know there are certain times a year where we do more installations than others. And I don't need the data to understand that the data are seasonal, for example. I may also understand that currently, you know, we're in a period of time where we have an upward trend. So one way, as we think about how do we build an exponential smoothing model, it's really choosing between those 12 different models, different types of trends and seasonal patterns. Your knowledge of the data, you may know that the data are trended. Well, that's great. I can eliminate all non-trended models. You may know that the data are seasonal. That's terrific. I can eliminate all non-seasonal models. And that would be the case if I worked for this phone company. I know the data are trended, I know they're seasonal, and I can narrow down the models to consider. If I'm new to the phone company and I didn't know that a priori, then maybe I'd graph the data. That'd be pretty reasonable. And if I have enough data, I could look at a graph like the one on the screen and say, yeah, definitely. You know, if I look at that trough, that's a December. That's a December. Maybe I could throw it into a year-over-year graph and notice that these months are moving together. That it's not perfect, but most of them are, you know, they go up and then they go down, et cetera. And certainly this area is pretty easy. So it's pretty easy to look at the data itself and determine if something is trended, if something is seasonal through a graph. The other thing I can do is to use an automatic approach, and Forecast Pro will do that. In fact, I'm just going to turn on the forecasts here, and you can see that without giving the program any instruction, we've generated forecasts for this data set. And it did so using what's called expert selection. Okay, so it automatically can choose not only the right type of exponential smoothing model, but also from other techniques supported in Forecast Pro as well. So let's go back to our slides for a second and think about how do we choose a model. Again, we've got these 12 different models to choose from. And one thing we can do is use our knowledge of the data. Another is we can look at graphs just like we just did. Or we could use an automatic algorithm. What I'll say about automatic algorithms, first of all, they vary between different softwares, but I would say that all of them are going to require data. An automatic algorithm is not going to work very well if you don't have enough data. For exponential smoothing, if we've got, you know, more than say 3 years worth of data, then an automatic algorithm is likely to work pretty well. If we have less than that, and particularly if we let less than 2 years, it probably won't work as well. And so if I don't have a lot of data, then I'm back to this domain knowledge, visual inspection of the data. And if I really don't have much data at all, let's say I have less than a year, I don't want to be doing exponential smoothing. I want to be using some other technique, maybe a new product, one designed for new products. Step one is model identification. It's choosing which of the smoothing models we should use. After we do that, we'll talk about interpreting the model. But let's go back to our example. So here we are. We have built a model, and there's a question of what model was built. Before we look at what Forecast Pro did, let's just think about the data. I know I want a trended model, and the trend here looks pretty consistent in the recent history, so I think a linear trend would be very reasonable. So my visual inspection here is leading me to believe we should build a linear trend model. What about the seasonality? Should it be additive or multiplicative? This is harder, but the way you do this is to look at sort of the peaks and troughs. And you look at the distance between, say, the most pronounced peaks and troughs, and ask yourself the question, are they becoming more pronounced as the data increase? Now, this is not perfect in this example. It's real data. But I think visually, I would say it does look like the peaks and troughs, the distance, are becoming more pronounced as the data increase. So visually, I'd probably go with a multiplicative model, and I'd say with a linear trend. So it would be an LM model or what's called the Winters model. So what did Forecast Pro do? Let's take a peek. Okay, so I'm opening up our forecast report here. Again, we used expert selection, and here's our model details. It actually chose an additive model with a linear trend and an additive seasonal pattern, so an LA model. The model has different parts here, and let's make a little more space on our screen. One thing is the smoothing weights. The smoothing weights control how much emphasis to give recent data versus the previous history when estimating each component. The smoothing weights vary between 0 and 1. If a smoothing weight is small, and by that I mean close to 0, then we're going to do a lot of smoothing. So the level smoothing weight is 0.03. That's a very small value. And it says to get the current sales level, we're going to use a lot of data. We're going to do a lot of smoothing. On the other hand, the smoothing weight for the trend is 0.99. That's very large. And what that's saying is we're going to emphasize recent history a good bit. So our trends are changing in time, and we're going to put more emphasis on the recent history when coming up with our current trend. The seasonal pattern, the smoothing weight is 0.24. So that's a moderate value. We're certainly doing a reasonable amount of smoothing, but not as much as we were for the level. So in terms of interpreting the model, one thing you have are the smoothing weights. They don't really have a lot of direct interpretation other than if they're close to 0, you're doing a lot of smoothing. If they're closer to 1, you're doing less. Now, these numbers, these smoothing weights, go into a set of exponential smoothing equations. This webinar is not long enough to go into the details of how the statistics of the models work and how the equations work. But if you are interested, you can certainly read about it in the Forecast Pro Statistical Reference Manual. You can also read about it in any textbook that covers exponential smoothing. Suffice it to say the following: we put these smoothing weights or parameters into exponential smoothing equations, and the output is what's called final values. Final values are pretty interesting. They are conditions at the end of the data set, and they're used to construct the forecasts. Let's take a peek at what we have here. The final value for the level is 65,782. What that's saying is your current sales level is 65,782 units. It's the starting point for the forecast. The final value for the trend is 742 units per month. Your demand is increasing. You have an upward trend of 742 units per month. If we're creating forecasts, we're going to start at the final value for the level, and in terms of trend, we're going to add 742 units per month to get that linear trend. Finally, we get to the seasonal pattern. This is an additive seasonal pattern, and you're going to see 12 separate seasonal indices, one for each month. January has an index of 780, February 1,499. Some of them are negative. Here's May, minus 568. But these are basically the seasonal pattern. This is the amount that we're going to, because it's additive, to add on to that underlying trend to introduce the seasonal pattern. With an additive model, these indices are positive and negative numbers, and we add or subtract their values from the underlying trend. I'm going to actually go to our forecasting tab. I'm going to click on winters, and that builds a slightly different model, and it's a multiplicative one. And the reason I did that is I want to show you how the multiplicative model works, because it is the more common one. Everything else here is pretty much the same. The smoothing weights would change slightly, but they're still showing small values for the level, big value for the trend, moderate value for the seasonal pattern. The final values have changed a little bit, but not much. And what's really changed, though, are the seasonal indices, which had been positive and negative numbers. Now they're numbers that are above and below 1, and they're all positive. They're multipliers. Let's look for our largest one here, and it appears to be March. So the March value is 1.08. If I multiply something by 1.08, it's going to increase it by 8%. So what it's saying is March is a strong month. I have 8% more demand in March than in a typical month. On the other hand, if I look for the smallest one, it's definitely December, 0.81. If I multiply something by 0.81, I'm going to lower it by 19%. So what it's saying is, in terms of telephone installations, December is your worst month. We're installing 19% fewer installations in December than we are in an average month. One of the nice things about exponential smoothing is that in addition to getting the forecast, you also get information about the data. And that's not true of many forecasting techniques, but it is true of exponential smoothing. Let's go back to the slides for a second and see how this works. We have the smoothing weights. They're shown here. The weights take on values between 0 and 1. The larger the value, the more emphasis on recent history. The best practice is to optimize the weights, and we do that by minimizing what's called the fitted error. I mentioned that some implementations of smoothing vary, and in fact, I've mentioned that some are poor. One of the reasons that some are poor is they take shortcuts in the smoothing weights. So these are things you should not do. Don't use a single smoothing weight for the different components. In our example, we have 3 very different values for the smoothing weights. There are methods known as double exponential smoothing and triple exponential smoothing, and these methods enforce that we use a single weight for the different components. That's been shown to be detrimental in terms of forecast accuracy. Another thing you'll find is that some software packages will use standard values. So instead of optimizing them, they'll just use the same value for everything. That also should be avoided. Why do people take these shortcuts? One byproduct of doing that is that the models can be very quick to build. We don't have to optimize these smoothing weights, and so we can make them very, very quick. But the problem with that is it's at the expense of accuracy. So again, in terms of the model, we have the smoothing weights. The other thing we were looking at is the final values. The final values are reflecting conditions at the end of the data set. What is the final value for the level, the trend, the seasonal indices? Those are shown as an output on the forecast report, and you can actually use them directly to build the forecast, and that's what's shown down here on the slide. So the first forecast that we're going to generate will actually be for June of 2020. We're going to start at the level. The final value for the level was 65,870. It's right there. Okay, so we're going to take that. We're going to add to it, because we're going forward a month, we're going to add to it a trend. The final value for the trend was 779. That will be the beginning. And then the last thing we need to do is to multiply by June's index. June's index is here, 1.03. If we multiply it in, we get a forecast of 68,682, which is shown right here on the report. So generating the forecast is really just using the final values as building blocks and constructing them. If I'm going forward 2 months, I start at the level. I have to add 2 trends because I'm going 2 months forward. And 2 months is, for this example, is July, so I need to multiply by July's index, and that yields my forecast for July, 69,272, which is shown right here. So again, exponential smoothing, these basic models are very straightforward. They are capturing different types of trends and seasonal patterns. They are using an equation or a set of equations that require smoothing weights, and they tell you how much emphasis to give recent versus past history. The output from the model are the final values, conditions at the end of the data set, and those are used directly to build the forecasts. And now we're going to actually move on, and we're going to look at some extensions to exponential smoothing. And to take us on that journey, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Sarah.
So as Eric mentioned, we're now going to talk about extensions of exponential smoothing. Before we jump into that, Eric did mention that there are other terms for exponential smoothing or types of models that you might hear about, things like Brown exponential smoothing, or he also talked about triple exponential smoothing. Pretty much across the board, those different types of exponential smoothing are really restricted Holt-Winters models. In essence, the Holt-Winters model really is the full spectrum of exponential smoothing. That said, while it is extremely useful, there are also a lot of extremely useful extensions to that Holt-Winters family. We're going to talk briefly about 4 of those, and all of these extensions are included in Forecast Pro. The first one that we're going to take a look at in the product actually is what we call the NACL model, or as we affectionately call it, the SALT model. This model is very useful for items that have what we call selling seasons. So items that have very strong sales at certain times of the year and no sales or very low sales at other times of the year. So things like snow shovels. Another very useful extension is the Croston's intermittent demand model. We're not going to have a chance to get into the details of the Croston's model, but the general idea here is that if you have intermittent demand, so if you have sales where there are very frequent periods of 0 sales and your data is non-seasonal, using the intermittent demand model is going to correct some of the overadaptivity that you might see from one of the base Holt-Winters models. We also have what we call custom component models. And this, like actually the NACL, is unique to Forecast Pro. But the general idea for the custom component models is that you start with a statistically estimated exponential smoothing model, but then you can integrate judgment so you can adjust those components as you see fit. And then finally, there's event models. Event models are extremely useful. So events are things that have a big impact on your sales. Things like promotions or stockouts, where you can visibly see a big increase or decline in sales, and typically you know what's causing that, and you can account for it through an event. We're not going to get into the details of this. We've actually done webinars entirely devoted to event models. We encourage you to take a look at those if you think that they would be of use. We're going to get a little bit more into the NA constant level model. The idea of the NACL model is that it's very good for products that have what we call a selling season. The NACL model is something that we created at BFS for Forecast Pro. The reason why we did that is we discovered that core exponential smoothing wasn't always working well with data where you see this type of selling season pattern. Let's take a look at how the NACL model works in Forecast Pro. What we're looking at here is what we call the agrochem data, and this is one of the many data sets that we actually ship with the product. If I expand all here and we look at what makes up this agrochem data, we can see that we have different growth agent SKUs and pesticide SKUs. If we concentrate first on this agrochem level, one thing that is certainly very clear is that there are certainly times of years where there are very strong sales, and then there are times of years with almost no demand. As we go through the different SKUs, you can see that pattern in a lot of these SKUs. And it's actually even more pronounced when we get into the pesticides. Here we have a SKU that literally is only sold during certain times of the year. So definitely very strong selling seasons that we're seeing here. Before we take a look at how the NACL model works, the creation of the NACL model really was motivated by the fact that the Holt-Winters core models were not working very well with data like this. Let's actually take a look at how an automatic exponential smoothing model will work. And actually, let's just apply the Winters model here. And to see that, I actually have to turn on the forecasts. Fitted. So what you can see here is the forecast is very low. So essentially, because demand at the end of the data set was very low, we're going to assume that current conditions are going to persist, and that level is going to remain very low. Let's take a look at what the model is doing here. So if I open up the forecast report Again, user-defined Winters model, but the level is really dominating the model here. This level is essentially 1, meaning that's extremely adaptive. The level of sales, we're assuming what happened last period is what is going to happen this week and going on into the future. So this clearly isn't working very well. The idea behind the NACL model is that it's pretty common to see that level component really dominating the data when you have data that has selling seasons like this. So let's take a look at how the NACL model works. And immediately you can see that during the forecast period, the forecasts make a lot more sense. This selling season pattern that we see in the history, we now see in the forecast period. And that's exactly what we would expect a good forecast to look like. You can also see that actually historically, the model isn't necessarily fitting quite as well as that Winters model. And that's actually pretty common when you're using models that have very high weight coefficients. It's adapting so much to current conditions that it can look like it's fitting, or it is fitting the model very well, but it's not forecasting very well. And one of the mantras of forecasting is it's not about fitting your historic data well. It is about forecasting well. So clearly in this case, the NACL model is doing a better job of forecasting. So let's actually take a look at the forecast report for this model now. And what I want you to note is that the level, the smoothing weight for the level is now very small. Essentially what we're doing here is we're setting that smoothing weight to be that 0.0001. So we're actually restricting the weight for the level so it doesn't dominate the forecast. And that then allows the seasonal components, which are really the more important ones for data with selling season, to have an impact. So that is a quick whirlwind tour of the NACL model. We're also going to take a quick look at the custom component model. So the custom component model is another model that is unique to Forecast Pro. And we're actually going to go back to that same connection data. What we want to look at is a 5-year forecast. So I'm going to go into options here, and I'm going to change this to 60. So now what we're looking at is a 5-year forecast for the telecommunication installations. And you can see that the forecast is extrapolating the trend that we see at the end of the data 5 years into the future. One of the issues with exponential smoothing is that it is better for shorter term forecasting. So it makes sense that this trend is likely to continue over the next year, but it seems a little bit aggressive to assume that beyond that first year or 18 months that you're really going to see the trend continue at that pace. That said, I need a 5-year forecast. How can I judgmentally adjust that trend so it does make a lot more sense? It looks a little bit less aggressive. I'm going to go to the forecasting tab here, and I'm going to select the custom component model. As I mentioned earlier, the custom component model, the starting point is a statistically estimated exponential smoothing model, and then you're allowed to change final values coming out of that exponential smoothing model to what you think is more appropriate for your forecast. The starting point here is basically the level, or it is the level estimate coming out of the exponential smoothing model. We have a linear trend here. We have the seasonal component. And again, we're not going to get too much into events, but you do have the opportunity to adjust event indexes as well. In terms of an adjustment that I want to make here, I don't want to assume that there's going to be a linear trend going out for a full 5 years. So I'm actually going to choose bent automatic. The bent automatic is going to basically allow the trend to decrease a little bit from one forecast period to the next. How much do we want that trend to be decreasing across time? There are a couple of different ways that you could do that, but one way is you can adjust what the total forecast is across this entire forecast period. Coming out of the statistical model, we have a 5.3 million forecast. What I can do is I can change that to something like 4.5 million, apply that. What you can see now is the projected trend looks much more reasonable. And in terms of 5-year forecast, this is something that I might feel better about presenting to management. And that is our quick whirlwind tour of the custom component model. So let's go back to the slides and just quickly summarize. Exponential smoothing is a very useful time series method. It's very commonly used because it works well and it's easy to apply. The model includes 3 data components: level, trend, and seasonality. And this is appealing because it makes it very easy to explain how the model works. It is adaptive to change. So it is the most current data that is going to get the most weight. The forecasts reflect current conditions, and again, this is being adaptive to change. Therefore, the model is best used for short-term forecasting. If you extrapolate too far into the future, assuming that things are going to, for example, increase at the same linear trend for 5 years, that can be problematic. So we really recommend using it primarily for horizons of maybe 12 to 18 months. And as we just went through, there are a lot of very useful extensions to the basic Holt-Winters models, and that allows you to account for a wider array of data. So data, the intermittent demand data, data with selling seasons. It allows you to incorporate things like events, and we encourage you to use those extensions.
Okay, so we have reached the magic hour. So I want to thank everyone for joining us and taking an hour out of your day to learn a little bit about exponential smoothing. I hope you found the webinar useful. It is part of a quarterly series, so 3 months from now we'll be reassembling with another topic. We haven't quite decided what the topic is, but it will be keeping you in the loop once we do. So again, thanks for attending and hope to see you next time.